Hello and welcome to another episode of documenting REST APIs using OpenAPI 3.0 in VS Code. In this episode, we'll be talking about how to get yourself set up to start documenting REST APIs. Let's start with the checklist. To get started with documenting REST APIs, you must first establish your points of contact. Points of contact refer to anybody who will be helping you throughout your documentation journey. And then you also need to make sure that you have access to all of the tools and the services you are trying to document. You also need to choose the language of your choice, and then also think about the documentation tools that you would be using. In this video, we look into each of these steps one by one. In our next video, we'll also demonstrate the recommended setup for this series. So who should be your points of contact? First, you need to define subject matter experts. Subject matter experts are those who would help you throughout your documentation journey. They have in-depth knowledge of each of the endpoints, including the properties. They understand the quirks and inner workings of the API. Then you have your peer review circle. Once you have drafted your API documentation, you need to make sure that you have captured all the information authentically and accurately. Peer review circle will help you ensure that the information is accurate and authentic. And then comes approval circle. These are the people who approve publishing your API documentation for public or internal consumption. After you're clear about your points of contact, you need to think about your documentation language. First is the human readable language. This is the language your consumers or your documentation viewers would consume the documentation in. It could be either English or any language of your choice. You also have your structuring language. This is basically the language you would structure your document in. The most common types of documentation structuring language at the moment are JSON and YAML. Throughout this series, we'll be structuring our API documentation using YAML and then convert it back to JSON for documentation viewer purpose. Okay, points of contact done, documentation language done. Now we need to think about API tools and other services. So when we talk about API tools, you need to have access to the collections that you are trying to document. API collection refers to the list of APIs that you are trying to document. You also need to set up API testing tools. Depending on your organization setup, you might already have access to API testing tools. But if you don't, you can use Postman. For this video series, we'd be using Postman too. And then comes authentication and authorization. Now, this is one of the most crucial part because without authentication and authorization keys or mechanism, you wouldn't be able to access your APIs. You wouldn't be able to test them, or you wouldn't be able to write your documentation. Authentication and authorization should be provided by your organization or the provider who you're trying to document for. Depending on the organization you're writing the documentation for, you might also need access to their tenants. Tenants basically is an instance of their software somewhere on the web. And if you don't have it already, you will also need server details. Organizations can maintain different types of API servers. Some might be for testing, some might be production. But what you must be interested in are production server and testing server. Production server to note the actual response the end user would be seeing, and test server to carry out your test. Once you have ensured that you have access to all the resources you are trying to document, you need to think about the tools that you would be using to document. First is the code editor. Code editor is basically a work environment where you would be writing your documentation. You have documentation viewer. Now, depending on the organization, this might already be set up for you. But if you don't, our video will demonstrate an open source tool that you can use to view your documentation. Just like an API test server, you also need a documentation test server. Depending on the organization, this might have already been set up for you. But if not, you could set up your local machine to act as your documentation test server. Don't worry if you don't know how to do that. We'll be showing that in our next video. Finally, we have documentation repository. Documentation repository is a safe place where all of your documentation hardware goes into. While you can use any of the version control system available in the internet, we'll be using GitHub primarily because it's free to demonstrate how to set up a documentation repository in the next video in this series. Okay, that brings us to the end of this video. In our next video, we'll be demonstrating a dummy setup that you could use throughout your documentation journey. Till then, stay safe.